part of one's own dominion, and that's what Russia really did for the first time in the mid-16th century.
In 1552, Ivan and his army lay siege to the Tatar stronghold of Kazan. The fortress of the Khan commanded the lower Volga, the Viking trade route to the riches of the Orient. Ivan prayed before holy relics, while his warriors stormed the gates. The Tatar fortress fell. Ivan's eastern armies never looked back. By 1556, Russia ruled the Volga River route all the way to the Caspian Sea. Kazan and Astrakhan, lands that had long been the Tatars' home, now belonged to the Tsar of Russia.
During the reign of Ivan the Terrible, he expanded at the rate of something like, on the average, 50 square miles per day during his reign. It was an extraordinary thing, a feat bested only by Americans in their drive toward the Pacific from another coast.
To commemorate his victories, Ivan erected a spectacular holy tribute in the heart of Moscow. The Cathedral of Vasily Blazhenia, St. Basil the Blessed. A masterpiece of art and architecture, St. Basil's would become a symbol of Russia itself. Ivan's passion for land and power was matched in those years by passion for his wife, Anastasia. His bride came from a family destined for the pinnacle of greatness. Anastasia was born a Romanov.
When she was his wife, the Tsaritsa, he loved her very much. There were no executions. He behaved very well. All of his contemporaries remember this as the finest time of his reign.
Tsar Ivan was in his glory. His court was rich and strong, his empire expanding. His influence was sought by the Poles, the Germans, the Turks, even the English. And in 1554, his wife, Anastasia Romanova, delivered the Tsar a healthy heir to the throne, a Tsarevich, Ivan Ivanich. Then, in 1560, fate seemed to turn against Ivan. A devastating fire swept across Moscow. Anastasia fell sick with a terrible fever. The Tsar prayed for God to spare his beloved. His plea was met only by Anastasia's death. A new and terrifying Ivan emerged from the ordeal. The fears of his youth revived. Poison had taken his mother. Had Anastasia been poisoned too? Was his throne now the object of a dark conspiracy?
After the death of Anastasia, that particular death is really part and parcel of a much larger complex, of which Ivan no longer can begin to trust completely the Boyar families that are around him.
The Tsar turned on his advisors, military heroes, trusted noblemen. They were cast into prison, subjected to torture, banishment, or worse. A bitter saying was born: the closer to the Tsar, the closer to death. The Tsar came to be known as Ivan Grozny, a word that translates as awesome or dread, but most commonly as terrible.
The nickname Terrible came from Ivan Vasilievich Grozny himself. In his own essays, he would state, a Tsar has to inspire terror. That is, he wanted to be called that.
The Tsar of Terror alienated even his closest allies. In 1564, Ivan's top general, Andrei Kurbsky, fled the field of battle and defected to Russia's enemies. Soon after, an angry letter from General Kurbsky arrived at the Tsar's court.
Monarch who was once blessed by the Lord, but who is now corrupt to the depths of his soul, why have you murdered the illustrious warriors whom heaven had given you?
Kurbsky's accusations fueled Ivan's rage to the breaking point.
All of this together seems to intimate to Ivan that he still has very real internal enemies.
Finally, on a December day in 1564, Tsar Ivan threw his empire out the door. Faced with another power struggle, he chose instead to quit the Kremlin.
He appealed in a letter to the Moscow people, complaining that he was leaving the post of Tsar because he was not being allowed to rule, that they are stealing, and he is not being allowed to punish them.
The Tsar wasn't just going on a trip. He was moving out for good.
With a heart filled with sorrow, no longer wishing to endure your betrayals, we have given up governing the country and have left to settle in whatever place God may lead us.
Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Awesome, the Dread, Ivan the Terrible, had renounced his throne. The empire had no Tsar, the people no master. Russia was lost in the snows of a dreadful winter. December 1564. Tsar Ivan IV abandoned the Kremlin and renounced his crown. Ivan had been Russia's sovereign for over 30 years. Without the Tsar, the Russian people feared the country would fall apart, which was just what Ivan was counting on.
By abdicating, he removes himself from the religious and also the political constraints that bound him when he was an official Tsar.
This was a coup d'etat, which he performed because he knew he was going to be asked back to be the Tsar. He knew that the mood of the people was against the boyars, especially the people in Moscow.
The people came to him and they said in one of the classic Russian phrases, something to the effect that sheep cannot be without a shepherd. You may do whatever you want.
Ivan agreed to return, but only on one condition. He must have a free hand to rule Russia as he pleased and punish his enemies any way he chose. 2 days after Ivan's return, the terror began. At the foot of the Kremlin walls, Ivan slaughtered his so-called enemies. He ordered the execution of hundreds, nobles, counselors, even priests. They had opposed his wars, denied his taxes, questioned his sanity. They paid with their lands and their lives. To crush all opposition, the Tsar unleashed his own private army, the Oprichniki, 6,000 murderous thugs. They were cloaked in black and free to slaughter any who questioned Ivan's dark disorder.
These were people recruited from some dregs of society who could ride a horse, and these people put a death's head on the pommel of their horse and would go around terrorizing the population.
In a distinctly Russian version of the Spanish Inquisition, Ivan's Oprichniki spread a reign of holy terror.
They would dress like monks. They would act as though they were in some kind of quasi-monastery, and yet at the same time, they would be engaged in terrible killings. They would be engaged in terrible tortures.
Tsar Ivan himself, it is said, developed a connoisseur's appreciation for torture.
He would sometimes even invent special executions, which were not just executions, but also showpieces. For example, he would blow monks up on top of a powder keg. He would say, "You want to be like the angels? Well, here you go."
Ivan's atrocities fused with mysticism. To purge the earth of his enemies, he would massacre not just noble boyars, but their entire families.
What it does is to leave no one of the family to pray for the dead. And by leaving no one to pray for the dead, it's as though Ivan was stretching his power into